think it's right to start now. So, hi everyone. To accommodate all time differences around the world and people who are participating, good morning, afternoon, and evening. My name is Mohammed Al-Rumaizan, and I am the coordinator for Task Force number 9, Migration and Young Societies. I'm also a researcher at King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. Thank you to each one of you for being with us today. We're very pleased to welcome you all. Today marks our first webinar, which is occurred under the title Migration and Young Societies Post-COVID-19 Challenges and Opportunities. We're very proud to be able to host such an event and host you all. Before getting started, I would like to express my appreciation to all panelists and participants coming together and discussing dynamic topics related to the implication of COVID-19 pandemic on migration and young societies. We have a broad range of experts coming together to discuss this topic in detail. Of course, COVID-19 has no doubt disrupt household government reactions as policymakers with balance of public health and economic downturn. The topic of our task force becomes more relevant to organization and governments and policies. Such consequences surely will influence the agendas of our task force from many dimensions, such as migration, forced migration, labor youth, young male and female workers. This webinar aims at bringing experts from different backgrounds to meet and discuss changes and implication of COVID-19 on the topic of our task force and beyond. To keep the panel discussion smooth, I would like kindly to ask you to write your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll get to your questions before the end of the webinar. In addition, don't forget kindly to mute your mic when not in use. And lastly, and more importantly, kindly do not exceed the time allocated per each speaker. Without further ado, please join me to welcome the chair of the T20, of the Saudi T20 and Vice President of Qabsar, King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, Dr. Fahad Turkey. Dr. Fahad, you may begin your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mohammed, and ladies and gentlemen, it's really a great pleasure to connect with you today. We've been doing a series of webinars since the start of this pandemic, and the purpose of it is to see how the pandemic and the ramifications of it are changing our priorities as we move on. As I would like to thank the lead co-chair for this task force, Her Royal Highness Princess Maha Al Saud, and also the coordinator Mohammed Al-Rumaizan for organizing this webinar and inviting all of you to participate, including the speakers. I would also like to thank Ahmed Al-Zahrani and Dr. Ahmed Al-Zahrani, the chair of the Employment Working Group, for agreeing to come and give us an opening remark on how the change in the working environment under COVID-19 affects the priority for the G20. So welcome on board everyone, and let me start by saying that definitely this pandemic has a major implication on not only unemployment or employment, youth and young societies, but I would say that it is above all a human tragedy with the most significant civilizational threat that we have faced in our lifetime. We The virus now spread to more than 5 million people in over 180 countries. Such a spread we have never seen in more than a century. And even with such a spread of a virus, has a major implications on our healthcare system, our society, our markets, and the economies. On the health side, we've seen that many even advanced healthcare systems around the globe get really tested with the overwhelming number of cases that goes to seek help on recovering from this virus. And from the socio-economic impact, which probably clearer for me as well as for many of the objectives of this task force. The socio-economic impact is very clear. I mean, we're looking at economic growth turning into negative territory. The IMF is expecting growth to be in -3 for this year. And while they are expecting a positive growth next year of around 4%, I doubt that is likely to be achieved for many reasons. One of them is related to the core of this task force, which is the labor market or youth unemployment, which reaching a very high level in the recent months. We've seen many countries going from very low number, 2% to 3%, to very high double-digit numbers. OECD is expecting around 25 million people to lose their jobs. And also SMEs are going out of business. Bankruptcies and news are covering headlines. And also major corporations or large corporations are facing difficulties managing their cash flow. So that's from an economic perspective. From a social perspective, inequality is deepening, and also we are unable to meet the needs of the most vulnerable households, including young societies, and also the elderly and vulnerable citizens in many places, especially in poorer countries. So to sum up the reaction of the policymakers, there are two groups and or two main decisions that many policymakers have adopted or taken. Each one of them is very difficult and put their economy and also the society in a very difficult position. So one option is not to act immediately and lock down. So if the countries do not lock down, they risk thousands of deaths from COVID-19 and also overwhelm their healthcare system. Alternatively, if the countries decided to shut down, as many countries have done so, they risk an economic collapse or a major slowdown in their economy with a high level of unemployment, high challenges in the society, issues, especially in poorer places. And probably you will see high mortality rates from non-COVID-19 related reasons. So from our perspective at the T20, we have called many times in our T20 statements that we should learn from from previous crises, where global unity and solidarity should be on top of our priorities. And we highlighted the required need in investment in critical public services and global public goods for the purpose of first suppressing the virus and also maintaining or minimizing the social and economic impact of the pandemic. And that's with the whole purpose of to recover better with the sustained and an acceptable level of global economic growth that will minimize job losses. If we look at the priorities for this particular task force, which we have organized with the leadership of this task force, the lead co-chair and the co-chairs earlier this year, we were talking about providing skills and opportunities for the youth, macro and microeconomic policies to address high youth unemployment, demographic changes, economic growth, and reform of social systems, labor market integration and social inclusion of migration, providing access and education opportunity for migrants and refugee children. And I think most of these priorities or targets that we want to address in terms of providing policy recommendations for the policymakers within the G20 and non-G20 countries, I think they are as important today as they were earlier in the year, especially with the global economy going into a contractionary mood. So what did we do from a T20 perspective? We have issued the 3 major statements since early March, before and after the extraordinary summit for the G20 leaders at the end of March. In these statements, we called for a coordinated stimulus package to allocate resources to businesses, workers, and households, especially in less developing countries. Some of the recommendations that are important to maintain the priorities for this task force is related to increasing transfer measure or social transfer measure, social protection or introducing a social protection or social safety net, reducing taxes, introducing lower interest rates, easing access to credit, restoring global supply chains and reversing slowdown in global trade. And more importantly, introducing insurance and wage support schemes, especially for SMEs and in developing countries. And because developing countries are poorer and poorer countries are more vulnerable to the current crisis, we also called for these countries to be allowed and immediately to suspend debt payments and to reassess debt sustainability, as this is going to destabilize poorer countries and hence the global financial balances, with ramifications on young societies and youth unemployment. So as we've seen in previous crises, especially in 2008, 2009 financial crisis, we call on the governments and monetary authority to continue to stabilize global financial markets by continuing to inject much needed liquidity. And not only that, but they should also work with private financial institutions to roll over debt to SMEs and individuals to minimize the impact of this pandemic on employment in general, unemployment, youth unemployment, as well as young societies. So it is an event like this where we discuss these priorities and the implications of the pandemic on it. And we can show show the capabilities of the think tank community and the think tank contribution to meeting the global challenges, as we saw in many of the policy briefs that were submitted to the T20 over the last few months. In the context of this task force, I think a crisis might play a constructive role in reforming and rebuilding the role of the multilateral institutions to address these issues. So I encourage you all to actively participate in this webinar and contribute to our core mandate as a think tank first, and also T20 second, which is providing a policy or research-based policy recommendations to the leaders of the world. And given the magnitude of this crisis, I would suggest that we should go beyond providing policy recommendations, but also suggest investment initiatives for the leaders of the G20 to rebuild a better world and ensure healthy economic, social, and financial well-being for all. To conclude, I would like to say once again that the T20 and its partners are devoting their time and effort to help the world in facing this pandemic. And it is events like this that encourage us to share our expertise. We look forward to working with all of you, as well as our partners across the G20 and non-G20 countries, to expedite the transition to recovery while maintaining an effective and strong economic growth that remain or maintain a sustainable level of unemployment and protect young societies. Thank you for your time, and back to you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Dr. Fahad, for your opening remarks. Now we will move to our keynote speaker, Chair of Employment Working Group G20 Saudi Arabia, Dr. Ahmed Zahrani. Please, you may begin your speech, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you, Mohammed. First of all, I would like to welcome everybody here. And as Dr. Fahad said, maybe good morning, maybe good evening. I would like to extend my gratitude to the T20 for hosting this webinar. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to join today. It's such a pleasure to interact with intellectuals and researchers from different backgrounds. I would also like to thank the T20 for their valuable contribution to address the global challenge presented by the outbreak and spread of the coronavirus. As we all know, this is an unprecedented pandemic that is having a devastating impact on individuals, families, communities, and more specifically on the labor market and the national economies and the global economy as a whole. Just to remind you, we at the Employment Working Group have 3 priorities for this year's presidency. One is youth, and the second one is transitioning social protection, and the third one, using behavioral insight in labor market policy setting. Women is a cross-cutting theme among all these other 3 topics. And these topics have been agreed and set at early this year, before even the pandemic. So how the pandemic would impact our priorities is a very important topic. One of the things that we have done is we had reviewed our topics in light of the pandemic and how related are they, and what kind of discussion and discourse would go within the group dynamics of how we discuss these topics. One of the good things, I think, as a presidency this year is the topic that we choose is very relevant to the pandemic. So just to give you an insight, youth unemployment remain a key problem. The global unemployment rate for youth is 3 times the average of the age group, other age group. Globally, 4% versus 12% for youth. This is, of course, pre-crisis. In the Arab region, this is even more severe, where we have 20% for youth versus 5% as an average. Adequate social protection is also only available to 29% of the global population. As we know, these kind of topics is recurring. They are multi-year agenda for our employment working group, and they are under a lot of zooming in, especially this year. We have seen how social protection, good system of social protection can be a solution to some of these challenges. We know many of employees in the informal market, many employees in non-standard form of employment or new form of work has less adequate social protection or no social protection at all. Most of these also group also youth and women. So this is a very important topic. Just to remind you, our leaders, when they met late March, they had made a commitment to monitor the impact of the COVID into the labor market, and 2 organizations, specifically ILO and OECD, they've been commissioned to come up with a report of how that might affect the global labor market. As we know, many versions of the reporting is evolving. Even ILO and OECD, they revised their impact. What's the impact of the labor market? One of the latest report is in terms of hours lost, it's equivalent to more than 230 million unemployment or workers around the world. So this is even huge by any term, by any comparison, even to the global crisis of 2008. The human cost of COVID-19 is very significant. Working hours declined by around 10.7% in the second quarter of 2020. And the number is between 250 million to more than 300 million of full-time jobs. Youth, particularly those aged 15 to 24, have been impacted by COVID. More than 4 in 10 young people employed were working in the hard-hit sectors. We're talking about sectors that really affected by the crisis. That is a total of 178 million young workers around the world, and almost 77% of the world young workers that were considered in also informal jobs. Children also usually refer to under 18 years old. Youth, I'd like to make a statement here that also youth is defined by the United Nations as individuals between 15 to 24 year old. On that basis, there were more than 56 million migrant children and youth in 2019. 1% of the total number of international migrants worldwide. 31 million of children were a new global survey by the ILO and partners of the global initiatives on decent jobs for youth age 18 to 29 revealed that over 1 in 6 young people surveyed have stopped working since the onset of COVID-19 crisis. Also, among young people who have remained in employment, working hours have fallen by 23%. Moreover, around half of young students report a likely delay in the completion of their current studies, and we know the implications of that, while also 10% expect to be unable to complete at all. Recent data also point from different countries around the world also showed that young people are disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 crisis, with massive increase in the unemployment rate and falling participation rate in the labor market. Not to mention the disruptive effect on education and training that are expected to have long-lasting effect on youth employment and income prospects. Young people are extremely hard hit, and there is a risk that they will be scarred throughout their working lives, leading to emergence of lockdown generation. It's sad to say this, but the pandemic has only worsened an already challenging situation for youth. Young people were already 3 times as likely as adults to be unemployed. Moreover, about 1/5 of young people worldwide, or 267 million, held a NEET status, not in education, employment, or training. That is just to show you how severe is the problem. However, with that being said, this pandemic has also enabled us to re-examine the effect of known barriers facing youth individuals in the labor market, such as required and relevant skills acquisition and training, or maybe values, or maybe even mindset. It has also allowed us to identify vulnerabilities such as non-standards and new form of employment, and to work with our G20 partners to create sustainable solution to support our young people. With this newfound understanding of the impact of the COVID-19, the G20 Employment Working Group has already started developing a set of recommendations to continue progressing toward Antalya target, where we agreed to reduce the number of youth at risk of being left permanently behind in the labor market by 15% by 2025. Just to remind you all, this is an agreement by our leaders in Antalya 2015 to reduce youth at risk by 15% in 2025. We are at midterm, and as a presidency, we're taking this commitment, and we're trying to create a program around this commitment in terms of framework, in terms of measures, in terms of youth action plan, and we're working with other G20 members as an outcome of our priority for this year to come up with action plan for youth. We are also developing recommendation to strengthen support for youth during the times of an economic downturn, also improving successful labor market entry point for them, and to tackle barriers that exist for quality employment, not only for youth in generally, but also with more specific for younger women too. And here we're hoping to explore more with behavioral insight as a tool to work on some of the barriers and to inform beneficiaries in the labor market of different programs. As you know, sometimes program uptake is also a problem. There is a bias, there is informational biases, there is social pressure, there is also other biases that kick in here, and we think there is an extra mile for opportunity to design our policies to be more behaviorally informed. Given the focus of this webinar, I would like to extend my support for this specific topic, and I would like to welcome also your thought and input and questions that you may have. I certainly look forward also to hearing the debate today and will be taking note to report back to my colleagues, and in my capacity as a chair of the G20 Employment Working Group in 2020, I would like to thank you, all of you, and I'm here maybe more to listen to your insight and thought, maybe more than just to talk, and what I thought to give you insight of what we're doing as the Employment Working Group. Our leaders has met also in 23rd of April. It was extraordinary meeting of employment ministers where they come up with a statement. We think that a statement would give us also the roadmap from here until September, where our ministers will meet again to agree on the actions and declaration that we are already discussing with G20 members these days. Thank you again for your time, and I would be happy to listen to the rest of the webinar.
Thanks to you, Dr. Ahmed, for your insightful presentation. Now we will begin our first panel, which is dedicated for our co-chairs, before beginning with our second panel, which will focus on our authors. Our first panel will be moderated by Dr. Maha bint Mshari Al Saud, Her Royal Highness. She is the lead co-chair and vice president of external relation and advancement at Al Faisal University, consultant of internal medicine and senior clinical scientist at King Faisal Specialist Hospital and Research. Then followed by Dr. Govan Sak, senior economist and managing and area studies program director of TBAP, the Economic Policy Research and Foundation of Turkey. Last but not least, followed by Dr. Astrid Skala Coleman, who's the director of a global partnership and co-chair of the T20 Germany 2017, Forced Migration Task Force, GIZ. I will leave the mic now to Her Royal Highness Dr. Maha to begin her presentation, which shall not exceed 5 to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Muhammad. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I'd like to offer my deepest gratitude to all the participants in this task force. It is an honor and a privilege to introduce my esteemed co-chair, Dr. Astrid Scala-Coman and Professor Guvensak. They will be sharing their unique expertise and perspectives in the first panel. And as a task force, we were presented with policy briefs that were high level and high quality. Although we would have liked to have all esteemed authors present, we tried to choose a mix of topics that would cover migration and young societies. Each of our panelists will present to us their outlook on our challenges. This is a world that shook and created new realities for us. The rift of inequity widened, and a pandemic that quarantined all the globe, closed borders, and stopped economies. Migrants are largely devoid of legal and formal status. They are mostly trapped in a situation where repatriation is nearly impossible. Health, education, and training, they are all challenges affecting the most vulnerable, the women and the youth. As we watch failure of multilateralism, a rise of nationalism, trading control and privacy for security, the G7 summit postponement for lack of representation, the world will look for a new voice. We think that G20 is well positioned to create and maintain a repository of all breakthrough ideas. These ideas are going to be the new platform of a humane future based on equity. I look forward to engaging all of our esteemed authors now and at the Q&A session at the end of the presentations. Thank you so much. And I would like my co-chairs to say their, to share their thoughts. Thank you very much.
Dear Professor Guvensak, thank you, Dr. Maha. You may begin your talk, Dr. Guven. And please note you're still muted.
Thank you. And I'll be very brief. I'm wondering nowadays how the world has shifted from optimism in 2015 and now the pessimism of today in 2020 to 2015 to 2020. That was the year 2015 was the year of the Turkish presidency of G20, and I was started working with T20 at that time. But it is not only virus related. I think we need to take into account the fact that this shift to pessimism from optimism of 2015 is not only related with the virus. We already had enough problems. I think this shift to pessimism made G20 more relevant for today's problems also. I just would like to underline where we were at the start of this year, before the virus, let's say, in terms of thinking about the issues related with this task force, because this task force is also very much relevant, as mentioned before by Ahmet Bey and Dr. Fahad Al-Turki. They made strong points regarding that. You know, when I'm thinking about this task force, I think there is one mega trend that's shaping our world, and that's the global demographic change. And that demographic change process has different impact in different countries. In the north, there is an aging population. That's an important issue, bringing its own problems. Last year with Japan, we started discussing that issue a lot. In the south, in our neighborhood also is the youth bulge, the young population, finding jobs for them. And also in the whole developing world, I think, we have a migration problem that we need to take into account. Migration from the south to the north, which is an important issue that we need to take into account, and we need to find some orderly and safe solutions also at the same time. You know, at the start of all discussion before the virus, I was thinking, we were all thinking that in the north, the issue is about designing sound migration policies for sound migration. And in the south, it's basically a jobs and growth agenda and more investments that are needed for infrastructure, both health and also education in the south. And for the transitory countries like Turkey nowadays, refugee hosting countries, I think, we need to find a solution to the issue, because 87% of the migrants are hosted by developing countries, neighboring developing countries, basically. And Turkey is one of them. In our region, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan are all countries that are hosting refugees and dealing with these problems. It looks like a regional issue, but it is a global issue that we need to take into account. And then the virus came. And then the virus came, I think it led to a process that's unimaginable at the outset. It led to a sudden stop in the real economy. You know, in the past, in our type of countries, in the developing countries, we were very much used to sudden stops in the real economy. But at that time, it was basically a result of a stop of financial flows, a problem related with financial markets. But now, the real economy itself stopped because of the lockdown, because of the physical distancing, the only measure that we know of in order to control the spread of the virus. And that creates enormous problems for everybody all around the world. But the problems, I think the virus exacerbates our existing vulnerabilities, and the problems are becoming more important for developing countries, not only for the low-income countries, but for all developing and emerging countries. And I think now the role of G20 is to provide, Dr. Fatih Al-Turki has mentioned very correctly about this coordinated stimulus package issue that was mentioned. I think we need more now in order to prevent at this stage a kind of a new global debt crisis that we need to deal with to, you know, to make all our problems worse. We need more efforts, more global efforts, more coordinated efforts to control the problems in the developing countries, I think. And of course, when it comes to, I mean, when you make a list of the ones who are more vulnerable, I think refugees are at the bottom also in this whole process. There is both a healthcare issue that we need to deal with, especially now in terms of the forced migrants inside Syria too, that we need to deal with. But also there is an economic issue that we need to control, because in the developing countries, if this process of physical distancing is going to continue a little further, then what we are going to see is that the hard currency earning capacity of all the developing countries are going to be negatively impacted. So I think this is, we are at a stage where G20 needs to be more active. So let me stop here. I try to be as brief as possible.
Thank you, that was amazing, and as usual, very insightful. I'd like to ask Dr. Astrid.
Thank you very much, Your Royal Highness and esteemed colleagues. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to give some insight into this webinar. I actually feel very honored and privileged that I've been with the T20 and in particular particular this task force on migration since early on, and I would like to give you first a little bit of an explanation of the context of the task force of migration, which I think is particularly important this year, and then second, a few thoughts on migration and how the pandemic is currently impacting it. So actually, Professor Güvensak was very modest when he mentioned his contribution to the T20. It was 2015 in Antalya when the T20 was actually born, I would like to say, and Güvensak, I would rather call him one of the fathers of the T20. In 2017, during the German presidency, the T20 became the structure we have today. The German presidency established the system of task forces and introduced a task force on migration, which was at that time justified by the current political situation. You may remember in 2017, forcibly displaced people entering Central Europe, particularly Germany, was a highly political question, and our chancellor brought this into the G20. Then during the Argentinian presidency, new focus came on board: Latin American issues of migration, gender, education. And then last year, Japan embraced migration and aging society, which was a particular topic for the Japanese society. So this year, I think we have a particular situation because Saudi Arabia is now taking, and I heard the word earlier from Dr. Fahad, looking into the global dimensions, because we are in times where we need to look at all this. We have a global pandemic, we have a global crisis, and I would like to say my congratulations so far to Saudi Arabia in this difficult time to show leadership, which has been already described by Dr. Ahmad with regard to the employment working group. Maybe last word for the T20, which is very important also for all our authors and contributors since 5 years. It is that the T20 is, by its own definition, a think tank of the G20. It's not just knowledgeable professors writing good papers, but it is really to bring concrete policy recommendations to the leaders, to the G20 working groups. And I'm very, very pleased that Dr. Ahmad is here, because the employment working group, of course, is very much related to, in particular in COVID-19 times, as you have already pointed out, to migration. So now my few observations on migration through a pandemic or COVID-19 lens, so to speak. I think we have to realize, if we look on the impact of COVID-19 through a migration lens, that there are several aspects. Some have been already pointed out by Güvensak. Firstly, we have seen that, of course, migrants all over the world, and we are talking about almost 76, according to UNHCR figures, forced migrants. We are talking about around about 1 million migrants at all, and not only talking about global migrants, but the internal migrants. And I think our dear friend Professor Mooney will talk about this. Most of them will be and are already refugees because of climate reasons. There are another maybe 200 million. I mean, these are just estimation, but we are talking really, really about a big number of people. So the first aspect is these migrants are, in all aspects, a very vulnerable group, and also as individuals. So, and then the second, the host countries where they are in the context of Corona also hard hit. I will explain why. And then thirdly, the countries of origin are particularly hard hit because these migrants are a source of a lot of remittances. And we have countries in the world, their GDP is around about 20 to 30%. Look into Central Asia, dependent on Russia, of remittances. Look in COVID-19 in Russia, closed down, lockdown. So all the Central Asians going back. But coming back to the first aspect, to the host countries. I belong to one of these host countries in the center of Europe, to Germany, and our media was full in the beginning of the lockdown. There were problems like our health system and the system of the care of the elderly seemed to really be also locked down. Also, people were there to be cared of because all the Polish, Eastern European care workers, health workers tended to go home because there was the last chance to go to their families. And not only in the health sector, but also in many EU countries, we have a lot of harvest helpers from poor countries. So it seemed that if we wouldn't have found particular regulation for them in the time of the lockdown, that there would even be a food security crisis in the midst of Europe, because we wouldn't have anybody to bring the asparagus on our table or the cherries from our trees. I won't expand on this because the time is limited, but there are also examples for this in other parts of the world, like Indonesian workers which left Malaysian rubber plantations and so forth. So, but coming back, and this is last not least, because ultimately we're talking about individuals, about people, very vulnerable groups, which already in normal times, so to speak, pre-corona times, had problems with access to social services, access to health services, education and protection, social safety net in many aspects. So this bad situation accelerated in the COVID times because people were moving again. They went home, they couldn't come back. Many of the internal migrants couldn't come back in China after the factories restarted to work. And now we have, all of you probably have seen the pictures in India, hundreds, or at least 100 million internal migrants trying to go home to their local communities without any money, transport down. Okay, let me summarize this. I think I have described, and you already know this, challenges we have for migrants as vulnerable group, for the host countries, for the countries of origin in Corona times. So this is a very important cross-sectoral topic for the G20, and I'm very grateful that other work streams and working groups of a G20 are hopefully listening to our contributions, will be reading our proposals and insightful policy recommendations, and ultimately come up with a strong say on a global solidarity, on more global burden sharing, and concrete proposals for the G20 leaders during the Saudi Arabian presidency later this year. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very insightful and very enlightening. Thank you so much. It's always wonderful to hear my amazing co-chairs who have had a great history in leading the T20. I would now like to move to the second panelists, and we can start with our authors. So Mohammed, it's, if you don't mind leading them. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Your Royal Highness, Dr. Maha, and also many thanks go to our co-chairs, Dr. Gavan and Dr. Astrid. Now we will begin our second panel, which is going to focus on policy briefs and related developments to COVID-19 and its impact on our task force. We will begin by Dr. Saeed Munir Khasro, Chairman of Institute for Policy Advocacy and Governance, IPAG. Dr. Munir, please feel free to begin your presentation within the time frame not exceeding the 5 or 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mohammed. Are we sharing the screen, Mohammed?
Yes, now you can see your PowerPoint slide.
Okay. First of all, thanks to the T20 Secretariat for having brought all of us. As we all know, we are living in under rather unusual circumstances, but thanks to technology, that even hundreds and thousands of miles away, we can see each other, we can speak to each other. And also thanks to Dr. Fahad Al-Durki, who has been spearheading the T20 process in rather unusual circumstances. If you remember Dr. Turki, when we first met in October, we had very little idea that this is the kind of situation we'll be in standing in June. So much has changed in such a short time. And of course, it has been a pleasure to be with this Task Force 9, led by Her Excellency Mahabin Mishari Al-Saud, and also two of my friends and colleagues, that is Guben Sak and of course Astrid. We have been working in this for the last 2, 3, 4 years. It's good to see both of you again. And the topic I'm going to talk about, which was a little bit alluded by Astrid, is about the climate migrants. Given that I have 5 minutes in time, I would like to rather move quickly. Let's have a quick look in the world we live in now. I guess you all are seeing some of the slides which Mohammed is putting up for me. So we are in another precarious situation. Even as we speak, we are have about close to 200 million people migrants in the world, and 2/3 are residing in G20 countries. And if you look at people who have been displaced for disaster-related internal displacement, the number is currently 2017 was close to 20 million, and by 2050 it's expected to go seven times fold, more than 140 million. And as the number intimated by Astrid, if things keep on moving the way as they're moving now, by 2050 we might end up in a situation of having climate migrants close to 200 million to 1 billion. Moving on, so what are the challenges? No, first and foremost, what still is unfortunate reality that the 1951 UN Refugee Convention does not recognize climate migrants and refugees. So that creates a problem both in terms of making estimation, because number of times multiplicity of factors happens, which some of my colleagues have already alluded to. Like the example of India was mentioned, where we have seen in the television how many people, economic migrants trying to get out of Delhi and Mumbai, being stranded in the highways. Then at the same time, we had the cyclone Amphan hit West Bengal. So how do we define who's climate migrant, who's economic migrant, who's forced migrant? So that continues to be a challenge. And UNHCR currently is already stretched, having to deal with more than 20 million refugees. So there is always the complex political question, can the world define the climate migrants? And once we do and give them the status of refugees, do we have the resources and the political will to take them on board? So that is one of the very crucial challenges, which leads to the next slide. Then why G20 is relevant? What is the context? Here you have 20 most economically powerful countries of the world, representing almost 85% of global GDP, 75% of global trade. And within G20 borders, as I alluded in my first slide, 2/3 of migrants are within G20 countries. And if you look at the internal displacement, almost 8.5 million people have been displaced in 2017. And what is also interesting, within this community are also high carbon emitting nations. So 80% of greenhouse emissions are happening from G20 countries. But what also is the ray of hope, some of the countries within this community also have state-of-the-art climate adaptation technology. So the sources, the countries from which this emission is coming, climate change challenges are emanating, are also the countries which have the resource and technology to help the world tackle the climate change and resulting migration. So G20 is in fact a good platform for 20 influential countries to come together and shape the global agenda and rally other countries around. Moving on. I'll quickly highlight some of the recommendations we made in our policy brief. One was, I already mentioned, the need for definition, norms, and regulation. And although we have seen some initiatives recently, like Global Compact for Migration did address climate migration, but it doesn't have any enforcement mechanism. And although we have seen European Union, UN raise this issue, the Refugee Convention still has not been amended. So good starting point would be to look into definition, rules, rights, norms, guiding the climate migration issue. Next. Recommendation 2. What happens to the people internally displaced? Now the reality is the world as it stands today, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or India or South Asia, Latin America, some of the hotspots, most of this internally displaced population, particularly those even by climate-related environmental factors, do not get the same treatment as do cross-border migrants. That creates a lot of complications for multilateral agencies like UNHCR to respond how to this crisis. So it is very important that people who are displaced within the countries are being first addressed, and to have some guidelines to bring them into fold, to have access to the resource and support which cross-border migrants have. Moving on to recommendation 3, which has to do with how we deal with, how do we handle this planned relocation. Now, the European experience showed us when people are displaced, forced migration, climate migration, economic migration, there is a lot of issues even within the community. We have seen within European Union what kind of fractured response was there. Some countries like Germany, France were open. Some countries blocked, closed their border, set up barbed wire fencing. So G20 can set the agenda how there is a collective share of responsibility of this migration, either internally displaced or climate-related issues. And for example, even there are countries who may not be in a position to host them, can certainly chip in other forms, contributing to funding, training, facilities. The bottom line is it has to be a shared global responsibility as opposed to shuffling between few nations, which makes the task even more delicate. Last but not the least, education is always a good investment. And for any migrant population, climate force, any definition it fits in, any given day, Mohammed, we need to move to the next slide. Yeah. So
Dr. Sayed?
Yeah, this is
the last. Could you wrap up in the last 2 minutes, a minute and a half?
Yeah, sure. I'll be done for that. Okay, so the thing is, this is the last slide. So the thing is, education continues to be an important factor, and any given day, educated, skilled migrant has a better chances of acceptability than uneducated, low skilled. Same situation happening with Rohingya crisis Bangladesh is facing. We have 1.2 million refugees. Nobody wants to take them, forget about the country from where they came. So this can be a good investment routed through UNHCR, UNICEF, TVET education. So this more or less captures the 4 key policy brief recommendations we have for the G20 Leadership Summit 2020 for under the Saudi presidency. But I'll be happy to take any questions the audience may have. And thanks to the audience around the world who's joining us today. Thank you so much, Mahmoud. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Khasro, for your presentation. I guess other panelists will contribute as well to the lively discussion of such significant topic. For now, I will move the mic to Professor Charles Martin Shields, Senior Researcher from German Development Institute. Dr. Charles, do you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. You may begin your presentation within the limit of 5-6 minutes. Good luck.
Okay. I'll start talking and we'll see when my slides come up, just to introduce myself and quickly say that the topic I'll be looking at is digitalization in the lives of displaced people. And when I heard about talking about this within the context of COVID-19, I thought there's some very tangible ways that the recommendations in this policy brief can fit into this kind of particular policy question. So do I have control of the slides? If not, we can go ahead to my first slide. Perfect. So generally speaking, just to give some background on the paper, digitalization is having a significant effect in the lives of displaced people. I think this came very much into the kind of public consciousness in the media space in 2015. In many cases, we were seeing media reports and discussions with NGOs about how refugees and displaced people were not only traveling with smartphones, but that access to the internet was a really key feature in safe travel effective settlement, staying in touch with family and friends, maintaining mental health, finding jobs. There was a great deal of discussion about all the ways that someone's private mobile phone affected processes of integration and safe movement. On the other side of the equation, from the institutional perspective, and I think very much in terms of what the G20 Development Committee can focus on, is the way that development and humanitarian institutions use these tools in outreach to communities, how they use these tools for managing documentation globally, and how they use digital technologies to empower communities. And what's very critical in all of this is the role of privacy and data protection. This is something that was a key recommendation, having standards for data protection. This is an ongoing discussion in the global humanitarian community. Now, for COVID-19 specifically, something we talk about a lot in humanitarian response and refugee resettlement is the importance of records and record keeping. There's been a push, especially within the, what slide am I on? In the refugee, the United Nations Refugee Agency, to bring a lot of documentation online to empower refugees to manage their own documents. Within a COVID-19 type scenario, bringing testing, tracing, and health records into a digital space that can travel with refugees is a particularly critical element for resettlement processes. So moving from a camp to a third-party country, being able to say, I have a document that is digital, that meets national health requirements for the country I'm moving to, and can be the basis for a new health record as someone settles into a country of arrival, is one critical way that digitalization in the lives of displaced people fits within the COVID-19 space. From an institutional perspective, most refugees and displaced people aren't resettled. They're living in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. They're either in camps or in cities. And one of the key challenges, especially from a public health perspective, is making sure that communities who live in urban enclaves or in rural settings that are hard to physically reach don't miss out on information about COVID-19 and the broader public health space. Tools like WhatsApp and using WhatsApp in connection with local community organizations can be an effective way to make sure that there isn't essentially a digital health divide between host communities and refugee communities when trying to adapt within the COVID-19 space. Within all of this, privacy and data protection is critical. I heard it mentioned before, both COVID-19 and refugee response are highly charged topics politically. We're already seeing the way that politics can very negatively shape the response to both COVID-19 and refugee livelihoods in Malaysia, with crackdowns on refugee communities driven by a fear that they are vectors for COVID-19. So to effectively use digital tools, refugee communities need to know that providing information won't cause them to be targeted. And that's important for host communities too. You don't want host communities who are afraid of refugee enclaves to enter those enclaves, not only for the safety of refugees, but because that creates new contact and it creates new vectors of transmission. So privacy has very practical implications for the management of COVID-19 within refugee communities. And to kind of bring this to a conclusion, this isn't just effort that gets put into responding to COVID-19. If we do these three things effectively, we as G20 countries who are, through our development agencies, involved in refugee response and humanitarian response, help set the groundwork for better health management, better health records management in the future. If we effectively use these tools for communication with communities, that builds a groundwork for future improvements in trust between host communities, between refugee agencies and NGOs and refugee communities themselves. And if we take on the effort now of establishing solid global standards for data protection and privacy, that pays dividends going forward as the global standard becomes digital identity and digital records management for people living in refugee camps, as well as those who are going to be resettled in third-party countries. So within the COVID-19 context, there is not only a lot of opportunity to use digital technologies to respond to this particular health crisis, but that in doing so effectively, we have the opportunity to lay the groundwork, to lay a foundation for better future public health responses for refugee communities, as well as building levels of trust and outreach and connectivity between communities, host communities, refugee communities, and humanitarian agencies. So I'll leave it there and I'll hand it off, and I want to thank everyone for inviting me to join.
Yes, thank you very much for your insightful presentation, Dr. Charles. And I would like to recall the audience and attendees that write down any questions and we'll get back to them later on before ending our webinar. Now, I will leave the mic to another panelist, Murad Kanan Olu. If you hear me, Murad, could you say yes, please?
Yes, I do hear you. Can you hear me?
Policy analyst, yes. Murad Kanan Olu, policy analyst at TBAB. Now you can begin your presentation.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and thank you for allowing me to present. Everyone gave out really good ideas until now. I hope to contribute at least a bit. So I want to talk about post-COVID world and integration of migrants as a three-way approach, three-way process. So I want to first start off by talking a little about the immigrant workforce in the times of COVID. Then what a post-COVID world looks like in terms of mobility and immigration, and then maybe talk a little about how I feel the integration question will be repositioned going forward. So in times of COVID, two things became certain to us. First and foremost, immigrant workforce has been at the forefront in fighting COVID, as they hold a lot of important jobs in healthcare sectors as well as essential services sectors such as food and grocery delivery, maintenance, and sanitation. On top of that, the pandemic has also shown that the G20 countries are heavily reliant on this immigrant workforce. And therefore, it has been felt, especially in key sectors like the healthcare. And the need for additional immigrant workforce has been evident. For example, in Italy, there are talks at the moment of speeding up the qualification recognition process for immigrant workforce to work in the healthcare sector so they can increase their capacities in hospitals. Similarly, Germany is at the moment looking for an immigrant workforce to work in the agricultural sector due to, and is having a hard time finding due to the border restrictions and closures in the region. And this has pushed some countries to find solutions at home. As you may well know, Italy just passed a law allowing permitting 6-month residency to more than 500 undocumented migrants so they can enter the labor force, and Sweden has extended another 12 months to its migrants as its resident permits of the migrants as well. And what the future holds is, even though it's uncertain, we can say that security checks will become synonymous with health checks. So there will be additional steps in entering countries. So all aspects of mobility will be undergoing a change, and they are already. And social distancing will mean more space but less human contact. And this will make us rethink the way we design airports, terminals, as well as how we view seating arrangements as well. And what we can say at the moment is that migration, at least for the foreseeable future, is going to be regulated because there will be additional steps. Even though immigration will most probably still continue, immigration to a country due to restrictions will be harder. And with regards to G20, we can say that pre-COVID problems of the G20 still persist. The problems of aging demographics and labor shortages still persist, but it will be compounded with the post-COVID realities, such as limitations on mobility and hardships for immigration. And this requires us to give, at least for as G20 countries, to find innovative solutions. And in this regard, it's a good thing to view integration as a three-way process, because this, as well as conferring responsibility to the migrant as well as the destination country, this view also confers some responsibility to the countries of origin in preparing their own own citizens for an act of migration. And a way to operationalize this process is by human capital investments in countries of origin or migrant sending countries, by destination countries, obviously with the collaboration of both countries and their with due consideration of their own labor markets as well. And this capital investments could take the shape of technical, vocational, educational, and training schemes, could be oriented towards low or high skill building, and also, like I said, considered of the supply and demand equilibrium within the labor markets of both countries of origin and destination countries. So while this would help improve the existing skill sets of the domestic labor force, and also provide the migrant, the potential migrant, with the ability to either migrate to a third country or stay in its own country and become a more valuable member of its labor market. And whereas for destination countries, this will allow, obviously, allow for a good injection of skilled workers and young workers to their labor markets, but also would allow for an ex-ante migrant management, meaning that they would start the process of integration prior to the act of migration. So in order for these skill building schemes obviously to bear fruit, we need increased interstate cooperation and deepening commitment to skills building initiatives that are global, as well as skills matching for labor migration. And an example of this would be Global Skills Partnership, where governments and IOM and ILO-like organizations come together to support the development and recognition of skills of migrants, especially youth and women. So in conclusion, I would say that we're bluntly apparent, something is bluntly apparent, that immigrants are an integral part of the G20 countries. I mean, their high employment rates within STEMs, as well as their jobs in essential services, prove that. But on top of that, it has shown us that immigrant workforce is resilient, and they are willing and eager to become a part of the countries they are hosted in. And due to the uncertain future post-COVID, and expectedly so the limited mobility and highly regulated immigration that will come with it, we have to remember as G20 countries that pre-COVID problems didn't go away, and even more, they will be compounded with the limitations on mobility. And therefore, we need to find innovative solutions to address these compounding issues. And this is where integration as a three-way process comes into picture. This is where all parties involved could gain something in investing in human capital. And for specifically for destination countries, it will make for better migration management and increase the prospects of integration once the migrant is hosted. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, dear Murad, Kenan Olu, for your presentation. I'm sure such a presentation discussing such a topic will trigger lots of questions from attendees. Now, I will invite Amal El Youssef, International Relations Specialist at Policy Center for the New South, to talk about her topic and presentation. Dear Amal, do you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. You may begin your presentation.
Thank you very much. And first, I would like to start by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to be able to speak on the topic of migration, and also for putting it in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. I will start with linking the topic of our policy brief that I co-wrote with my colleague Ghazi Tayyib, who is also economist from the Policy Center for the New South. And so if you want to put the question of migration in the context of the current crisis, we have actually looked at it as both a catalyst, like a factor that increases the possibility and the chances for migrants to lose job opportunities in their origin countries, but also to lose job opportunities in the host countries. So if we look at the forecasts of the ILO, it shows that one of the most sectors that will be hardly hit by the crisis is the sector of services. Unfortunately, a lot of origin countries are really focusing on the sector of services as one of the factors that in which they rely their economies, and that of course creates a lot of vulnerability and a lot of problems when it comes to the perspectives of the labor market. And hence, this is all going to contribute at the short and at the long term in deepening the root causes of migration. This means that irregular migration from origin countries is likely to increase because of at the aftermath of the crisis, and vulnerability is also to be increased. And there is something also very important, which is the foreign-born unemployment rate, which is a rate that was developed by OECD, and that looks at the proportion of unemployment in the categories of people who are not born in the host country. So, for example, if we look at the EU, which is one of the main destination countries for at least for African migrants, the foreign unemployment, the foreign rate of unemployment for foreigners was already high before 2008. But when the 2008 crisis came, this gap have even become more wider because of the fact that migrants are generally categories that are very vulnerable. So whenever we have a crisis, and specifically with the effects on the economy and the society, migrants have more chances to be excluded from the labor market. They will witness problems into getting into the labor market, and also in renewing their job permits. So if they have already lost their jobs, it's really hard for them to regain another job. And because generally, as Her Highness also Dr. Maha has mentioned in the beginning, crises are also the times where people are more prone to nationalistic and inward-looking social policies. And this is, of course, not working in the advantage of migrants who are already in their host countries, because the decision makers are more likely to be willing to serve first their nationals and then look for other more vulnerable categories. When it comes to linking the subject of our policy brief to and providing recommendations for the decision makers of the G20, we thought that, of course, the G20 is very concerned by the question of migration and young societies, because most of the countries of the G20 are the countries that are most destination of migrants. We have also shown that most of the migration, and except from the specific case of refugees, is motivated by economic factors. When we look at the profiles of migrants, they are typically within the working age population. They are males, and they go to other countries to improve their living conditions. This is of course, that implies a lot of consequences, both on the migrants themselves and on their host and origin countries. So when it comes to what we can do to be able to mitigate the impact of irregular migration, because we do believe that regular migration is not a problem in itself. It's at the contrary, it's an opportunity. It does allow an encounter of two needs from societies that are experiencing demographic challenges, and it's a positive point, but it becomes problematic when we are speaking about irregular migration that puts the lives of people in danger. And in this regard, we do recommend a set of policies to be taken. First of all, to try and create decent jobs in the origin countries. The international community has been speaking about tackling the root causes of migration, and the creating jobs emerged as one of the ways to do that. But creating job is not alone is not enough. These jobs need to be decent and need to allow for their for the workers to be able to have a certain level of social protection, and be able to also implement their personal and social projects, which is unfortunately not the case in many origin countries. And this is something that we have to pay attention to. And I think I'm a bit exceeding the time, so I will try to conclude very quickly. So we think that it's all about push and pull factors. A lot of migrants have the push factors in their societies: lack of good governance, lack of adequate social policies. This is how, and this is why they take the dangerous journeys. So a lot of work is to be done to improve the social coverage in these origin countries, and also to improve the quality of dialogue between the donors and the governments in the origin countries, in order to agree on the priority areas of help. I will just stop here, and if you have any more questions, we can discuss them in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Amal, for being in time, and also for your relevant presentation to the topic of our task force. Now I will invite Dr. Bachaya Sirivin Obot to begin her presentation. Bachaya, do you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much, Mohammed.
Yes, as soon as you speak, I will go on with your slides. Good luck.
Alrighty, thank you very much, and hello everyone. First of all, I would like just to thank the Secretariat of T20 as well as the Task Force 9 for the invitation for us to join this webinar. So basically, our policy briefs titled as a fiscal sustainability and social cohesion in the face of demographic change. Before I go into into detail about the policy brief, I would like to introduce to our co-chair, co-authors for this policy brief. So we have quite a number of the co-authors for this policy brief from Asian Development Bank Institute, ADBI, as well as from the American Enterprise Institute, and then CAPSA. So just for the policy brief to be developed here is just to answer to the three challenges, main challenges that we coming up with. So the first one is about the possible negative impact of the population aging on the fiscal sustainability. So we try to answer on how to prepare the G20 economies in the face of rapid demographic change when we categorize the group of the country in this the G20 economy into three groups. So which are the aged economy, and then the aging one, and the last one is the economy with younger population. And the second challenge is just how to promote social cohesion at the different phases of the demographic transition. And the last challenge is just the recently emerged one related to COVID-19 pandemic. So as we all know that the global government, they launched many fiscal stimulus in response to the impact of the pandemic, which can cause the severe fiscal deficit, as well as when we're looking at the policy response or the major response to the impact. For some reason, the response to exclude the vulnerable group for the policy response. So with all these challenges, we developed the full policy recommendation with the different aspects. Can we go to the next slide, please? So for the first two challenges, we come up with this full for recommendation. As we know, to cope with the fiscal deficit, we try just to the under-aging population is actually shrinking the taxpayer base. So what we try to do is to, in response to that, to improve the policy of productivity with two main approach: by enhancing the labor participation through the female participation, extend the retirement age, as well as to adopt the effective migration policy. In related to that, we also make a recommendation to invest in human capital for higher skill. And in line with that, this recommendation, we make it even more specific to recommendation investment in the education. And this is just to prepare the future generation for a job with focus on productivity, entrepreneurship, and innovation. And three critical skills that we emphasize here is just the critical thinking, the emotional intelligence, and also the flexibility. Not just only to prepare the younger generation, it's also trying to encourage the lifelong education to equip the older generation and current working population with the new knowledge to cope with the technological advance. Or together, we just to help improve productivity. And then the next policy recommendation is also about fiscal policy, which means how to strengthen fiscal framework in coping with the fiscal deficit. So basically, there's two sides of it. One is about the how to enhance the government revenue. We basically just suggest to raise the tax revenue through our alternative fiscal instrument. This is basically because a lot of developing countries, they base their tax revenue on the income tax. So we suggest the shift in the of the tax revenue to other kind of tax like excise tax, gratuity tax, or even environment tax. For the particular for the developing country in the G20 group, we also recommend to review the tax administration. This is just to increase the ability of the government to collect tax. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? And then at the last last policy proposal that deal with the first two challenges is to propose the comprehensive reform of the public pension, social security, and healthcare scheme. This is to introduce the inclusive set of the parameters that should be included in the to make the complex modeling for the defined pension and the social security system. And my last slide, we just talk about the policy response to the COVID-19. So for the post-COVID-19, we like just to highlight 2 points that are very important here. As I mentioned earlier, fiscal stimulus has been launched all over the world, and this actually caused a lot of government, including the G20 government, that's facing a severe fiscal deficit. And this need the with all this impact together, is need the international collaboration to help each other on that. So international communities seek to find a way to stabilize market and also create an option to reconstruct in the post of the COVID-19. And having that said, in that the national level, all the government had to keep in mind with the lesson learned from this situation that happened to create a sufficient fiscal space as a preparation for the possible impact that may happen in the future from the epidemic or pandemic. In terms of the social cohesion, it's very important just to propose the inclusive measures that will decide the response that recognize the situation and diversity of the health cross age group, not just only particular group, and expand the coverage of the social pension and protection scheme to the vulnerable group, which particular in the informal sector, this includes the older people, female worker, as well as the migrant worker. So just to sum everything up here, whatever the G20 policy maker going just to adopt as their policy response, it's very important just to looking at the country characteristic. because we have 3 different sets of demographic transition and tailor and customize to fit with the situation that happened in the economy. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bichaya, for your presentation. Bichaya, who is an economist and researcher at Asian Development Bank Institute. After now, we will move to our next panelist, dear Sarah Luchtenberg-Kasten. Do you hear me?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, Sarah Luchtenberg-Kasten, Research Fellow, Policy Decision Science at CAPSARC. Now you may begin your presentation.
Great. So are you posting the slides there? So thank you everyone so much for the opportunity to present today, especially you, Mohammed, for organizing things for this and Task Force 9 leadership too. I'm really thankful to keep going in this presentation kind of in the end because all of my fellow panelists have done a great job framing the issue. So I'm hoping to keep my presentation a little bit short so that I'm not covering information that you've already provided for us. So what I'd like to highlight is supporting this effort through both T20 COVID-19 Task Force and CAPSARC is supporting Dr. Yasin Arabi, our task force lead in that process. And as you see with this, we received more than 100 abstracts and expression of interest to participate. And it was really interesting to see that education
Dear
was
Sarah?
Yes.
Allow me to interrupt you. Your voice is somehow disconnecting. It's not as clear as it should be. I will let you. Yes, I will let you try again. And if your voice is clear within 30 seconds, then I will leave you continue. Otherwise, we will go to the next panelist and get back to you. So you may try now for the next 30 seconds.
Okay, can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yes, of course.
Okay, super. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. What I'd like to cover here is that CAPSARC is supporting the T20 through a couple different layers of education component. First of all, supporting the COVID-19 Task Force Chair, Dr. Yasin Arabi. And the task force received more than 100 abstract proposals and expressions of interest. And what we're hoping to do is narrow those down and work with the policy papers, and we'll be seeing those in the months to come. So if you can flip to the next slide. So what you see here is the overarching themes, and similar to what Dr. Zach characterized, yes, this is an environment of, it's a difficult time, there's a lot of pessimism, but what we're hoping to do with this contribution to the COVID task force is take an optimistic perspective and wrap those ideas and policy approaches and the best thinking so that we can create not a business as usual scenario, but a bounce back better approach to education after the pandemic. So go to the next slide. So we're super fortunate to have Dr. Prachi Srivastrava as our lead author. And on May 5th, the COVID-19 team hosted a webinar on the topic. So I won't go into all of the points that she covered. You can listen to the recording of that, but let's just summarize. COVID-19 is the largest education disruption in history, and most of those policy papers will be discussing how to rebound from that. So next slide, please. So in addition to our support on the COVID-19 issue, we had begun a paper on education for migrant youth. And when I say migrant youth, I'm saying intentionally like moving from one country to another, legal migration, but also internal displacement and refugee issues too, and illegal migrants. So we're defining this rather broadly. You see there the two co-authors, but I wanted to give you kind of like some of the background as to why we took this on. Both Dr. Fraser and I have worked in communities with internally displaced and refugee populations and have witnessed firsthand those impacts when children cannot go to school and the devastating lifelong obstacles that people face as they grow up. And secondly, as a mom who's been educating kids at home for the last few months, I've witnessed the challenges that we have in our education system. And education is at the forefront of every mother and father's perspective from the time their kid is born, especially when the kid is about 3 years old and they're like, I gotta get this young one out of the house into preschool, let's get this education going. So, but as a person who's grown up in the developed world, I've had the luxury of something called choice. And if you put yourself into a mother's position who's refugee or displaced, very different. So we've had an excellent introduction from Dr. Al-Zahrani linking education to employment. So we can go into that much at all, but let's look at those targets. The UN is wanting to get the 3% of refugees that attend university up to 15%. But without some decommitments, financial commitments and other commitments, it's going to be difficult to get that done. And so what I like to do is just cover the obvious. There needs to be increased funding because education is the afterthought. It's shelter, it's food, it's water, it's health. And then after that, there's no money left. So it has to get on the policy agenda. And then let's kind of reference what our other panelist, Amal, referenced was people may turn inwards. And what we're needing to reiterate is education is a global public good, and education is not to be politicized. So the G20 can throw their weight with this type of messaging and to remove the scarcity mindset and instead seeing education as an investment, not as a financial cost. And finally, strengthening the community of interest. I'd like to reference Charles Martin Shields and his approach to the technology solutions. We need a broader community of interest of educators, humanitarian organizations, G20 communities to have this creative approach. So yes, these are hard times, but in hard times, we often find ourselves growing stronger and having more opportunities. So with that said, thank you so very much for the opportunity to participate in this important work. And we're looking forward to the efforts in the months to come. Thanks.
Thank you, dear Sarah, for your thoughtful presentation and comments, and actually your address to the topic of our task force. Now we will move to our last but not least panelist for today's webinar of our task force, dear Omar Kadukoi, policy analyst from TBAF. Are you with us, dear Omar?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Yes, you may begin your presentation, and I would like to point that Omar does not have slides to show. Please.
Yes, indeed. I thought because I would be the last one to present, give Mohammed a break from pressing all of these buttons. So I'll just be making brief talking points. This webinar has tapped on different subjects, and I will talk about future of work, COVID-19, and the double jeopardy in the developing countries, including these two topics. So today we have two sources of competition in the labor markets. One is relatively new, which is technology, and the second one is older, but picked up heat in recent years, which is migration and immigrants. Now, the common denominator between these two sources is them triggering the notion of us versus them. And this is seen in not only in the labor market, but also with regard to accessing public services such as education and health. So what happens in a time of an economic slowdown, like the one triggered by COVID-19 nowadays? Well, the economic slowdown amplifies the backlash that is already existing especially in destination countries, against immigrants, and gives rise to birthrights versus human rights debate. Why? Because the impact of both technology and immigration affects the labor market asymmetrically. So in this sense, technology is reshaping the classic atmosphere of work through a transition phase called the future of work. And the example of online food platforms clearly explains how this transition is happening at 3 levels. So first, you have a high-end level impact where the collection and distribution of orders is the task of artificial intelligence algorithms. And then you have a mid-end level impact where the process of preparing the orders is not fully automated, but actually possesses a great potential to become fully automated. And finally, a low-end level impact where the delivery of orders is still undertaken by human couriers who tend to be at the lower spectrum of labor skills. Now, where do immigrants fall in this example? The presence of many online food platforms increased competition and lowered the wages of the couriers. Thus, for example, in France, French couriers outsource informally their work to immigrants. And this is something, this example particularly is not exclusive to developed countries, but it also exists in developing countries as well, where the labor informality is even higher. Hence, citizens and non-citizens are in a fiercer competition. But of course, technology has more spillovers, both positive and negative. On the positive spillover of technology, we see that it creates more jobs and requires upgrading the necessary skills to fill these jobs. And one example comes from China, where, for example, a financial technology company introduced artificial intelligence to fill the tasks of loan officers. But in return, the company had to hire 3,000 data analysts to look after the algorithm of the AI program. So this is one example of the positive spillovers of technology. But at the same time, and the same example shows the spillover or the negative spillover of technology, which is polarization of skills at the both ends of the labor skills at the expense of mid-level labor skills. So aside from this, or on top of this, there are other negative spillovers of technology, including but not limited to greater inequality and expanding informality in the labor market. Now, this may not be necessarily a very critical case in developed countries, but this is more of a double jeopardy in the developing countries for the following points. First, advancements in technology allow developed countries to reshoring production facilities to domestic markets in a fully automated mode. Thus, this reshoring of production facilities has the potential to exacerbate the existing concerns in developing countries to accommodate the bulging young working force due to the already inadequate job opportunities. So this means that reshoring yields less economic convergence and slower urbanization. So youth in developing countries will always prioritize or will prioritize immigration to find job opportunities elsewhere. What is more, developing countries are also home, as Professor Sack mentioned in his remarks, it is home to the majority of forcibly displaced immigrants who already are in an informal labor competition with the locals. Last but not least, and with the economic consequences of COVID-19, will further skew this asymmetric and hence messy transition to the future of work, therefore compounding the already present challenges which were tapped upon by different panelists today. So this brings us to what should we be doing next? Dr. Al-Turki in his opening speech mentioned something very critical, which is we can turn this crisis into an opportunity, which is indeed why it is the time for G20 to be more active, not to invent the wheel, but actually to operationalize what is already existing. So the debt relief that was suggested by the G20 for low-income countries is the first step to do, but at the same time, the G20 should actually be more active in preventing a highly developing country debt crisis, which needs the G20, or should push the G20 to resort to the eminent persons report, which in its recommendations, they highlight the need to establish a special purpose vehicle. So the central banks in the developed countries could actually inject more liquidity into the developing countries, whereas Professor Sack mentioned there's a real economy problem. And if we do so, we will actually extend the lending capabilities of multilateral development banks, which bring us to the following point, that we need to support the small and medium-sized enterprises, because they are the engines that generate job opportunities in normal circumstances. But now with this cooperation between the G20, developing countries, central banks, and multilateral development banks, we can have further support for SMEs, where both locals and forcibly displaced migrants work in normal circumstances. With this, I end my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Omar, for your insightful comments, and also for somehow summarizing some of the important points made by earlier speakers, such as Dr. Sack and Dr. Turki. By now, all our panelists for our second and last panel have presented their thoughts. We will be moving on to our last and not least part of our webinar, Q&A and closing remarks. So far, we have two questions. I would like to ask our panelists to see if they can view the questions by clicking on the Q&A above on the screen. And I will ask also all our co-chairs to unmute themselves and try to engage with the questions. Dr. Sack, Your Highness, Dr. Maha. Dr. Maha, I cannot hear you. Dr. Sack?
Okay, no, here I am. I'm right here.
Good. Could you see the questions?
Just a second, yes. I was looking at another thing.
Yes.
Yes. So how about me seeing the question out loud, so everyone could hear it, then one of you or both could respond briefly and answer the question. So here is a question mainly to Murad and Amal, our earlier panelists. Also, earlier panelists could contribute and answer these questions. While this question is not solely to Murad and Amal, other co-chairs also encouraged. Briefly, the question says, COVID has shrunk the job market opportunities felt heavily by capital-intensive and traditional immigrants countries, and has already led to eventual job losses, repatriation of many temporary workers. The question basically says, how do we suggest integrated and circular migration? Can it be implemented a practical solution? While all co-chairs, and especially Murad and Amal, invited to answer the question, others also could share their views.
If I may, I'll just start with maybe a first part of the answer. So for us, and this is something that we have worked on in the Policy Center for the New South, we have tried to think about ways. So one, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, please continue.
Okay. Yes. So what we think that if you want to enhance the attractiveness of migrants, you have to make them an added value. How can you do this? Is in terms of training. So we thought that responding to a proposal like, for example, having hotspots for irregular migration, we can have training centers to make them have better soft skills, languages for the places that they want to go in, and to respond to your specific question on how, on like concrete ways to tackle this. First of all, the most effective way to respond to irregular migration and loss of jobs is the creation of opportunities for legal migration, and that's through the circular migration and through the partnerships for mobility skills. It means that for sure there are a lot of fields in the host countries that require skills that the migrants have. So if we can just work on bringing together the fields in which we need these migrants and highlight it to them. It's also important to have a good source of information. We inform them about the fields that they can fill. This is already something that we can start with, and it's really not very complicated because so many migrants, they don't have this information. And also in Morocco, we were also thinking about different ways to encourage the companies to engage with migrants who already exist in the host countries, because for so many countries, we have the clause for the preference for the national skills. It means that if you have the same competence, you are more, the companies will be more likely drawn to pick from their nationals because of no cultural barriers, no linguistic barriers. But we can, for example, the states and the governments can think of a way to encourage the companies to hire migrants through tax incentives. I know that it's probably not a solution that that everybody agree on.
If you could summarize your answer in 30 seconds.
Okay. So I would say that tax incentives for companies to hire migrants, and this kind of tax incentive can be also done or categorized as one of the social corporate responsibility for these companies in order to encourage them to also accept migrants in their workplace.
Thank you, Amal. The earlier question was posed by Reed Jamal. Another question.
Mohammed,
please.
May I?
Yes.
So I would say thank you for the question first of all, and I would say at the moment the focus should be on social safety nets and livelihoods, and ensuring the basic needs, ensuring access of migrants to basic needs, as well as ensuring the provision of these basic needs. But going forward, I would say, and I must add that any kind of package that's a stimulus package, that COVID response package should consider these social safety nets as well, aside from just SMEs. But I would also say that COVID offers certain opportunities as well, because now, due to limited mobility, we have some precious time in our hands, and rather than quick fixes, we can come together at this moment and actually exchange practicable, applicable ideas that we can actually establish on the ground. And rather than saying, well, rather than passing a law in a day or two, we can actually compose a plan that we can establish. Thank you for your question.
Thank you too as well, dear Murad. Now we will include another question from Dr. Manuel Schubert, one of our authors. I will read out loud quickly his comments and question. Dear colleagues on the panel, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I think outlined very clearly various challenges that we G20 are currently facing. However, what I have missed in your presentation are the concrete solution that Dr. Astad mentioned earlier. What do you propose in terms of usable and actionable policies to our leaders? That's on one hand. And the other, how should G20 countries especially initiate, recommend, or implement in order to overcome these challenges? So I will invite our co-chairs or any of our panelists to respond to the question within less than 3 minutes.
May I comment? Thank you very much. Just a short comment to the first part of the comment of Dr. Schubert. I think it's a very relevant one because I made it clear earlier that our task was, this is not a university seminar where insightful professors give contributions, but we want to address these topics to the relevant work streams within the G20 and T20. And I think this is up to the T20 Secretariat, which could be very helpful because in the policy briefs, in the individual policy briefs, of course, we find a lot of concrete proposals. It would exceed such a webinar to present all this. So my suggestion to this end would be, because I think it's very important that we are heard with concrete proposals, that the G20 Secretariat carefully looks into the policy briefs and takes out what is directly addressed to working groups of the G20 or to the level of the leaders and take this up. Thank you. Yuvan, you want to add something?
Just a very quick comment. You know, at the beginning, Dr. Marzani has noted one from the Antalya Declaration about decreasing youth unemployment 15%. I think that all depends on, you know, about improving skills within that youth. That's the major missing issue. But now, the current situation that we have, although we can make, you know, investments for that purpose, I think in the current situation, there is the need to prevent any further deterioration in the economic situation in the developing countries that are hosting the most of the refugees, majority of the refugees at the moment. I think the things that are happening in the US, as the things happened before in China, forewarned all of us about what we're about to face. I think the things that are happening in the United States in terms of social cohesion, social unrest, are also a warning for all of us in order to take active measures to cope with this situation and to start burden sharing, a kind of a global burden sharing fund as quickly as possible. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Sack. We are running out of time. If there is a last word or comments,
I do.
Hanif, the co-chair.
Yes, please.
Within 1 minute,
have,
Your Highness.
I do have a couple of things. One of them is for Sarah, and it is about you know, what has been you know, covered before in that were strong policy briefs on the topic that you have chosen in 2017 and 2018 Task Force on Migration. And I hope you can, you know, shed some light and you know, integrate your thought process with that. The other one is I have a question to Charles or Guven, and it is the role of digitalization in regards to remittance or digital financial transfer, especially now that we see that there are platforms and cheap phones and you know, WeChat. There are several new application software. How do you know, see the privacy and you know, maintained, and with the digitalization? These are questions to be pondered, things, you know, where we think about privacy and how we can protect it, and you know, how we can fix the informal economy and introduce kind of formal economy with that kind of financial remittance and commerce. I would love to hear more from you, but it seems like this is all the time that we have. I have enjoyed it immensely. It's lovely to see my new friends, and I wish you all the best. I can't thank you enough for your contributions. You're changing the face of humanity. There's no more important time than the time we are in right now. And I have lots of hope just because, you know, you are there and you are contributing. So thank you so much. I really highly appreciate everything that you have contributed. Thank you.
Thanks go to you, Your Royal Highness Prince Dr. Maha, and also to all co-chairs. Before ending our webinar, I would like to say two announcements. The first one is a reminder for all our authors to submit the amended policy brief by the upcoming deadline, which is due on 14th this month. And the second announcement for those who haven't had the chance to type in their questions, please forward your questions to me, and I will try to get back to you with responses from the co-chairs or any of the authors within 24 hours. You can reach me through my email, which you may all know. Again, thank you very much for all authors, co-chairs, and as well friends. As me, a coordinator, it's very lovely to see you all live after exchanges lots of emails. Good luck to you all.
Thank you. Bye.